Spectral Waltz by Richard L. Elsliger. I took delivery of the old grand piano on a rainy Saturday afternoon. The truck backed up to my front door and parked on the grass, to which I presented no objection, for today was a special day. It took 2 strong men to move the antique, the fine instrument weighing in at a good 800 pounds. The piano cabinet consisted of the most ornately carved wood imaginable, built from the hands of the finest late 19th century artisans. The most exquisite and delicate carvings adorned the musical desk, and thick curved dragon's legs supported the massive weight. It was emphasized when I purchased the instrument that the utmost care be exercised during transport, as this piano was a true classical piece, an old Steinway made during the latter half of the 1800s. The sales representative claimed that the great Franz Liszt had once played this piano for a small group of concert-goers on a Saturday night somewhere in Europe more than 1 century ago. I expressed my sincerest doubts about the veracity of such claim, and the sales representative sensed my disbelief, reversing himself by stating that the claim amounted to nothing more than an unsubstantiated rumor. Sensing my reticence about such an implausible claim, he removed some paperwork from a neatly kept file folder and presented to me a certificate for further examination. I read the details while inspecting the entirety of the piano, noting the workmanship performed and the quality of the cabinet. I knew how to play, but I also knew how pianos were built and understood the mechanisms involved, of which there were many, from the moment a key was pressed to the point the hammer contacted the string. The inner workings of pianos fascinated me without end, the intricacies of the many varied moving parts laid out for each of the 88 keys, and the critical symbiotic relationship between the performer and the mechanics of the instrument. The shop assured me that the restoration work was a thorough one, using new Steinway certified felt hammers, new strings, and a complete refinishing of the harp and wooden cabinet. The paperwork presented for my perusal confirmed this fact. The Steinway factory indeed performed the work, making the restoration a Steinway certified piano. That selling point I hadn't anticipated, and I checked the serial number on the piano for verification and confirmed it to the number on the certificate, noting that the numbers matched. Much like automobiles, pianos, and particularly Steinways, all had their own identification number, a serial number unique to that specific piano and no other. The exterior possessed the most elaborate carvings of any instrument that I'd ever witnessed, the birth of the piano having taken place during the height of the Romantic era of music, an era that I specialized in. I sat down and did a few warm-up scales. I could see from the corner of my eye that the sales representative watched with a modicum of amusement, likely thinking me another mediocre performer, and then I deviated and began to play the haunting bars of Chopin's Nocturne in B-flat minor, and I could see him take a small step back, surprised by the sudden shift in my performance abilities. Aside from my subtle boasts at the keyboard, I realized that this piano had me in its clutches and would not let go. I had to have this piano and no other. I simply could not say no to the purchase. Staff emerged from their offices to listen as I progressed into a much more difficult repertoire, playing Chopin's fiendishly difficult etude known as the Winter Wind. The sweetness of the treble and the thunder of the bass resonated tones of such exquisite timbre that I never heard in all my years of playing. The one critical part that had not been replaced on this piano was the Sitka spruce soundboard that most musicians and technicians consider the heart of the instrument. The Steinway certification had stated unequivocally that the soundboard was original and flawless. Soundboards were known to split over time, caused primarily by dry environments and sun temperature fluctuations. When a soundboard died, it is said that the piano also died. In such instances, it was deemed better to replace the soundboard or simply choose a different piano. When a soundboard was replaced, it severed the soul from the instrument, relegating the piano to an impostor of its former self. Cutting the soundboard from a piano was a form of butchery, akin to removing its heart, much the way the surgeon removed Chopin's heart when he died, a little-known fact. Chopin's heart today exists in a jar of brandy, well preserved in his native Poland. His heart is considered a national treasure, and anyone familiar with his music might understand why. The soundboard of this Steinway, though ancient, remained immaculate, its sound resilient, channeling the rich tones of Chopin's music with an inexplicable magic I'd never experienced on any piano ever before. I approved and made my down payment on the spot, with the balance to be paid upon delivery. The purchase plundered my bank account, but for me this purchase was once in a lifetime, and I transferred the funds without reservation. One could never put a price on beautiful music, and this instrument suited my every desire. Now the delivery men struggled with the behemoth, rolling the body down the truck ramp and negotiating the steps that led to the entrance of my home. They rolled the Steinway through the front door without a bump or bruise, their execution flawless. The piano rolled across the hardwood floor on a trolley, and the men settled the Steinway toward the inner wall as I directed, fully aware that placing a piano up against an outside wall would expose the instrument to unnecessary temperature changes. The movers brought in the ornate dragon legs and bolted 2 of them to the Steinway before hoisting the cabinet to a horizontal position to bolt on the final leg. The last item to attach were the pedals and the lyre, a brass-shaped harp that embellished the sustain and una corda pedals, completing the Steinway, a masterpiece of creation. The Steinway filled my living room, a full-size battleship that displaced the peripheral furniture, claiming its right to be the centerpiece, demanding all of the attention. The men removed the blanketing that cloaked the Steinway to reveal the piano's woodwork in all its 18th century glory. Seeing the antiquity poised on the curved dragon's legs, coupled with the shine of a polished brown natural finish, made my heart melt. I knew that with this piano, my virtuosity would manifest in a rapid and dynamic upward path. I tipped the men for their service and thanked them for bringing my baby home unscathed. When they left, my house fell silent again, just me and the Steinway. I missed my last relationship, but it was fated to end. She resented my music and disliked my electronic piano to such an extent that she warned me she would leave if I persisted in playing music on the cursed thing. I'd not met a music hater before, and it was not only the romantic era music I played, but every form of music. In the car, I knew her to switch off the radio regardless of the station, unless it bellowed out talk or the news. She wanted nothing to do with rock, oldies, rap, disco, or anything with a beat or possessed of a sequence of musical tones. It fascinated me that someone could exist in this world and harbor such an intense hatred of music. I since learned that the condition was known as musical anhedonia, meaning that such individuals were suffering from a neurological condition. Although they recognized music, they were fully incapable of enjoying music and actually disliked it vehemently. The incidence of the aforesaid disorder in any given population ranged from 5 to as high as 10%. I wanted the relationship to work, but she could not bear the sound of music, and this broke my heart to its fundamental core. It took me over a year to get over her, and I suppose this piano purchase served to recoup some of my former happiness that had been ripped away from me. I dismissed these harmful thoughts from the past and went to my Steinway. I propped the lid to reveal the golden harp that cradled the shining silver strings, and I opened the fallboard. I sat at the bench and played a chromatic scale from the lowest note to the top. The lower keys thundered like the exhaust of a vintage race car running at full bore. The middle range keys were possessed of a silky smooth, chocolatey resonance. The upper range sounded like the chimes of clanging wine glasses. I began to play Chopin's Raindrop Prelude, a pleasant yet simultaneously somber and dark composition, which best characterized music from the Romantic era and likely reflected Chopin's inner workings, such music revealing the man's tortured soul. The sound of the striking hammers on the strings filled my living room with beautiful sound, bringing to life a composition that survived across time. I concluded the piece and went to the kitchen to prepare dinner. While cooking, I thought I heard a musical note. It sounded like the faintest middle C, barely registering by my hearing, but there, I was sure of it. I lived alone and did not have a cat or any other animal that might attempt to stroll across the keys. I went to the living room and saw nothing out of place, and I summarily dismissed the notion as a note that played in my mind. I can hear whole compositions in my head, so it was not unusual for me to think I heard a note, when in fact no such note had played beyond that created within the mind. I brought my dinner into the living room and sat on the sofa, switching on the overhead lights and taking note of this new creature occupying a significant portion of my living room and my life. I regarded musical instruments, and more particularly pianos, as living organisms, elements that arose from the soil by sheer imagination and force of will. They were made of wood, which derived from a living organism. They were made of metal, the strings, harp, and tuning pegs, forged from the oldest, most elementary materials of this planet. The felt hammers themselves were woven from the finest merino sheep wool. Pianos had character and spirit to them, bringing music to all who chose to play and to those who chose to listen. The natural wood tones of the Steinway cabinet warmed my eyes every time I looked at it from the sofa. When I finished eating, I walked over to the piano and sat again, this time playing a variety of pieces, etudes, nocturnes, and sonatas. The music reverberated throughout the living room and echoed with sublime and haunting melodies. My hands interfaced with the keys, and a mysterious force kept me planted, holding me a willing hostage of the piano, even when I had the sense and inclination to conclude the practice session. I managed to break away and close the fallboard, but only after a number of hours wound off the clock. I covered the piano with a warm, quilted burgundy cover and checked the time to see that 4 hours had slipped by me unnoticed. That is the nature of playing the piano, and has always been, where time stands still while the rest of the world goes by. It is the most satisfying of feelings, and of that I unreservedly stand by this assertion, and always will. Bedtime arrived, and I retrieved to my lonely room. It had been so long since my last relationship, and I found myself remembering the pain of the breakup. It stung me worse than a scorpion. My music remained my constant companion, and when friends left and relationships failed, the music always filled the loss. I had no right to complain. I reclined towards sleep and drifted off to the most pleasant dream I could imagine. In this dream, I saw a beautiful young lady playing the very grand piano that sat in my living room. The melodies she played were otherworldly, enchanting and enticing to my musical tastes and sensibilities. She sat at the keyboard, dressed in a flowing white gown, and I saw her long, slender fingers brushing the keys with the finesse of a ballerina. And then she came to play the last melody, one of the saddest pieces I'd ever heard. I could not recognize the music, but the tone of the composition brought with it great pain, suggestive of a terrible loss. It sounded like a waltz as I counted the beats per measure in the customary 3/4 time. I immediately sat up in bed, opening my eyes to realize that the music was no dream. I turned my head to the right and looked down the hall. In the darkness, I detected the faintest music I could perceive, a waltz written in D minor, I believed. My first thought led me to the conclusion of a home invasion. I removed a can of mace from the nightstand and left the comfort of my bed, using stealth to catch this vagrant and immobilize them should they be armed. I drew closer to the Steinway, undetected, and could see a figure in the ambient moonlight that cast its pale beams through my living room window. She wore the very dress that I visualized in my sleep. I heard distinct sobbing as I drew closer. Then the music stopped and the dress vanished. I never got a look at the woman's face, only the dress. I switched on the light and saw that the fallboard was closed, the Steinway's keys untouched. The sight of an intruder in my living room bewildered my unsettled mind, my vision caked with the daze of an interrupted sleep. How powerful and marvelous the human mind! So much remained uncharted and unknown, susceptible to auditory and visual hallucinations in the still of the night. I opened the fallboard, exposing the keys, and played a few notes of the waltz I'd heard in my sleep. I chose the key of D minor, and it matched the waltz identically. When I played the opening measures as best my recollection could retrieve, my fingers slid on the keys, the tips slick from an inexplicable wetness, the wetness of a woman's tears, no doubt, when I recalled the details of this strange dream. My hands recoiled in fear, not expecting the corporeal sensations of a dream to manifest as reality. The keys of my Steinway were irrefutably wet. I sought out an explanation from the recesses of my mind, and attributed the wetness to a drink I must have handled before I sat down to play earlier in the night. Yet my mind could not recall any drink other than the drink I consumed with my meal, and that had happened well before I approached the Steinway. I deemed it unlikely, if not impossible, that I would sit at this beautiful grand piano with wet hands. In fact, my own personal diligence and conscientiousness forbade me from ever playing any musical instrument with wet or even damp hands, and that included my electric piano. I looked up to the ceiling to see if there might have been a leak, but that theory vaporized to the nothingness from whence it came when I looked to the moonlight casting beams across the living room floor. There was no plausible explanation, and I knew it. I went back to my bedroom and slept the rest of the night dreaming about this woman in the flowing white dress. When I woke up, I had no answers. I went to work, perplexed, still thinking about that dream. For a minute I entertained that my piano was somehow haunted, a ludicrous notion, as I did not consider the paranormal to be a viable explanation for the phenomenon. I worked at my desk, shoveling a snow flurry of paper throughout the day. The hours wound off the clock with exceeding lethargy, but as it is said, time waits for no one, and with such inevitability, the quitting hour arrived, and I was out the door, not a moment too soon. I went to a local restaurant for dinner, and when my order arrived, I played with my food, half eating and half thinking deeply about the purchase I'd made that now occupied the center stage of my private life. Had I bought more than just a piano? I needed to do additional research about this piano beyond the Steinway certification. What did I really know about its history? The cheerful sounds that came from this Steinway had enchanted me and influenced the more impulsive, less rational side of my thinking. I fell prey to its charm, but this was sheer nonsense to even consider the prospect that I had purchased a haunted piano. When I arrived home, I allotted my time to research the pedigree of this unconventional grand piano. I happened upon the Steinway site and discovered that the factory possessed volumes of records capable of bridging the passage of time to reflect the various purchasers and the individual histories to each of their instruments. All I needed was a serial number. In some instances, the site claimed the ability to tell unusual histories and aberrations associated with a given serial number, though I doubted that any such records would expound upon a haunting or a ghostly performer. I fell asleep in the living room, looking at pictures of old Steinways, hoping to get answers to the many proliferating questions generated by this strange instrument of mine. I nodded into dream sleep, watching a video that narrated the manufacture of a Steinway concert grand. The construction of a single piano could take over 1 year to complete, a rather involved process where they aged the Steinway wood for months before bending the rim and only chose optimal cuts of Sitka spruce for the soundboard, fabricating the heart and soul of each piano before that piano was permitted to roll out of their factory. I slept with significant sleep disturbances, my mind drawn to the Steinway and the hallucinogenic music generated by that bizarre dream, my dream. Again I heard that haunting melody, that quaint but sad little waltz, and again I saw the woman seated at my piano, a young woman in a flowing white dress. This time I saw her face, and she looked at me with a forlorn countenance, continuing to play the sad waltz while tears swarmed from her ghostly visage. I walked over to her, and by instinct I consoled her, wiping away her tears with a handkerchief. I appreciated her gracile features, and she appealed to me in more than an objective manner. Her tears erased, my sincere gesture elicited a smile from the corners of her full red lips. I woke up to a dark shadow that formed the outline of my Steinway, partially illuminated by the persistent moonlight shining into my living room. The piano bench sat vacant. I groaned and turned to rise up from the sofa. I walked by the Steinway and gave an appreciative nod before making my way to the comfort of my bed. At 1 o'clock in the morning again I heard the Steinway play, and this time it was not a dream, of that I could be sure. I seized upon the mace and made my way down the hall, furtively drawing ever closer to the individual playing my cherished piano. I glimpsed her long flowing dress of white that spilled over the piano bench and dusted the floor. A silvery blue glow enveloped her entire being, an unusual energy field that left me astounded. I'd not seen a ghost before, and I refused to believe what my eyes communicated to my exhausted mind. I stared with incredulity, listening to a ghost play the saddest waltz I'd ever heard. I backed away, not wanting to frighten the apparition. I needed more information on this piano, and I let her play while I retreated to my bedroom in eventual sleep. When morning arrived, I called the Steinway factory and gave them the serial number of my piano, and the representative asked that I hold while they checked their database. I held on for the longest time with nervous anticipation. The Steinway representative came back on, stating that he recognized the piano. He advised me that this Steinway came from Europe and has a detailed history. For a nominal sum, I could order the history by preparing and sending an order form that disclosed the relevant serial number of the piano. The history would be sent by way of an electronic file, and the answer would be available in 24 hours or less. I summarily paid the fee over the phone and awaited the result. I received an answer that evening after work. I read the information in the living room, occasionally glancing at the Steinway as I collated the details in my mind. The information consisted of static figures and facts, such as the number of Steinways made that year, the model number of this particular Steinway, the date of construction, and the materials used. I learned, in fact, that the Steinway had made its way to Europe, and the original owner had come from Belgium. A footnote at the bottom of the file requested that I call the representative at the stated number for more information. Without hesitancy, I called the number with nervous fingers, somewhat entranced with the notion that this call would reveal some of the answers I sought about this piano's possible dark history. I still rejected the concept of ghosts and the paranormal, but my eyes did not lie, and I knew what I saw last night. The phone rang directly to the representative, and he answered. I identified myself and the serial number of the Steinway. He advised that this piano was once owned by a Belgian countess in the late 1800s. My mind raced at the thought of my piano being owned by a royal figure from so long ago. I asked for more information, and he stated that he did not know the name of the countess, only that she had collapsed and died playing this very piano, and further, that the legend states that her death was the result of a broken heart. I could not believe the substance of what I heard, but inside it all made sense. I thanked him and ended the call without mentioning the spectral spirit I had encountered at my Steinway. I sat motionless on the living room sofa, thinking deeply about my purchase and considering my next step. I walked over to the Steinway and sat at the piano bench. I played a few random notes and stopped, thinking to entice the apparition. I waited for her response. I looked down and saw a single note play, middle C, and I pushed away in shock. "Are you here?" I asked. The middle C played again, and my mind scattered in all directions, creating a painful cognitive dissonance in my brain, for I did not believe in ghosts. I moved over to the sofa, shutting off the light, and stared at the Steinway in shadowy silence. I asked for her to play me something. I waited and watched. Nothing happened. "It's okay, Countess. I know who you are. I know what happened, and I understand. Believe me, I truly understand what it is to have your heart broken. I know." I waited for about a minute and said to myself that this is ridiculous. I got up from my sofa, and when I stood, my Steinway began to play that haunting waltz, and I sat back down, listening with amazement. I saw her outline materialize in the darkness, a glowing silver and blue form possessed of the most beautiful flowing gown and saddest face I'd ever seen. Her fate telegraphed to me across time. I heard her cry, and it captured in me a dormant emotion I'd suppressed for so long. I walked to the apparition and attempted to dry her tears, but my hand touched at nothing. She continued to play, baffling my sensibilities, for if she served as a projection in this realm, and nothing more, then how could she possibly play the keys of my piano? Such matters were better left to paranormal investigation as I drifted toward an uncharted mystical science of the inexplicable. I listened to her performance, captivated by what I heard and what I saw. My initial apprehensions faded away, and I remained awestruck by the beautiful spirit playing my Steinway while I listened. Her youthful face radiated an old-world beauty that riveted me. I paused to wonder a most ponderous question about the afterlife, as to whether we recaptured our youth. More unsettling, I wondered if our spirit attached to corporeal objects when we died, imprisoning our souls until the end of time. I spoke to her when she finished the performance, but she did not answer, but only smiled. All I could do was smile in return before she disappeared. I told no one of my encounter, and over the following weeks, the Countess appeared more regularly at my piano. I found myself falling in love with this spectral presence. She spoke to me through her music, and I communicated right back to her through my own performances. I was in love again, and sensed she was falling in love with me as well, Over a significant span of time, she played for me many of her contemporary Romantic-era compositions, most pieces of unknown origin, though I suspected that she'd written them when alive. The Countess filled my evenings with beautiful music and washed away the pain of my own loneliness. As the years flowed seamlessly under the bridge of my life, I came to realize that our separation had narrowed, and soon we would merge together when I inevitably left this plane of existence and entered hers for all eternity, my one true love.